All right, we will go ahead and jump into our next session here, Basic Needs 101 with Carrie Welton.
Hey everyone, welcome. I'm Carrie Welton. I'm Trellis's new Senior Policy Strategist as of 6 weeks ago, so really excited to be here presenting to you all. And what we are going to cover, and I actually apologize to the people who are joining virtually, but can I get a show of hands in the room of how many people feel like they're fairly comfortable with the basic needs topic? Okay, I love this. I love this. How many people are engaged in basic needs efforts in your institutional capacity or in your community? I love this. Okay, a little bit of preaching to the choir here. This will be great. So we're going to talk a little bit about income and basic needs security, and I am very grateful to my colleagues for having presented all of that wonderful data preceding this conversation. And then what I would like to do is give an overview of the public program landscape, because what I really want to impress upon you, and particularly given the context of higher education right now, which is that higher education is under attack and has been for some time, that institutions are being asked to do increasingly more with less or the same resources. And what I really hope that you take away from this conversation is to see opportunity in leveraging other sources beyond what you are currently giving and finding ways to do that that do not create additional burden for you, even though there will be a little bit of a call to action at the end. So that's partially true. And then what we're going to talk about is really what is the new vision for student support? How do we think about accomplishing change through this, new vision? And then we're going to go through several examples of that landscape of opportunity. I'm happy to save some questions available at the end, but also I'm going to be available all day, and I'll talk a little bit about ways to engage with Trellis if you're interested in thinking about some of these things in your state in a little bit more detail. So as I said, I really want you to walk away with an understanding of the non-tuition landscape. We're going to explore opportunities. I will touch a little bit on institutional opportunities, but full disclosure, I am not a higher education expert. Sorry, Brian. My background and experience is in basic needs in the human services public benefit programs. So hoping for you to see the opportunity in engaging those programs in your role as a higher education advocate, and then feeling empowered to engage. So we're going to maybe start on a little bit of a low note and hopefully end on a high note. As my colleagues just mentioned, basic needs insecurity is rampant, and this data is very consistent with what we saw from the NPSIS Nationally Representative Survey. And when we think about who is enrolling in college today, this paints a better picture of understanding why, because we now see that students with incomes below 200% of the federal poverty level are now making up the majority of undergraduate enrollees today. And in fact, lower income students are enrolling in higher education at rates higher than their middle income peers, because they see and understand that opportunity, as Carla and Allison mentioned, with that 73% really understanding the value from that education. And when we think about why basic needs programs, I do empathize with higher education right now, because I feel like you're a little bit being piled on in terms of all of the things that you are trying to navigate. But I want you to understand and see the opportunity to also think of yourself as advocates in basic needs programs. And for this reason, so we saw from the recently passed congressional bill that there are going to be significant cuts to the SNAP program, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps. The SNAP program provides a modest assurance that people can meet their basic need for food. So that is about $6 per day per person, and it is intended to be supplemental. The program requires that people contribute about 30% of their monthly budget to their cost of food. So if that seems like a very low amount, that is by design. And we saw that recently that federal package was the largest cut to the federal SNAP program ever in history. And one of the changes that is coming down that will impact states is, as it currently stands, the federal government funds 100% of the cost of the actual benefits. States and the federal government share the cost of administration, but the federal government funds 100% of the benefit costs. And approximately or up to 15% of the cost of those benefits is going to be shifted to states. I'm not going to go down the wonky rabbit hole of what that means about error rates. If that's something you're interested in, I have plenty of resources I can point you to. But I just wanted to provide a little bit of an example of what that may mean for states and for state budgets. So I included a couple of examples here, and apologies, the source isn't here. This is from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who said, if a state was faced with, let's say, a 15% cost of the shift of benefits, what might that mean for Pennsylvania's higher education spending? And we can see that the center's estimate was that about $636 million is what the state would be required to contribute at 15% to the cost of SNAP benefits, which is 2 times their state spending for community colleges. And then when we look at Michigan, about $456 million at that 15% percentage shift, which is about $462 million what they're spending on their community college students. And then in New Jersey, $287 million. The center's analysis does include a handful of state examples. Some of them are related to higher education, some of them aren't. So happy to provide that resource as well. But really, we understood what happened during the Great Recession when states were facing budget cuts, and that higher education was one of the first things that got sacrificed. So when we think about the importance of higher education, not just institutional people, but leaders, board members, trustees, ensuring they are having conversations with their state and federal policymakers about how changes to programs like SNAP and Medicaid are going to affect state higher education, this is why. And then similarly, we saw recent changes to the Medicaid program. There are a whole host of changes. I'm not going to go through them all. And as a matter of fact, analysts are still trying to understand what all of the implications are by state level, but it's incredibly complicated. So there's just a little bit of an analysis here of what that cost shifts, and this isn't annual, this would be over the 10-year outlay over the cost of the budget reconciliation package. And we know that when states are expected to spend more, that higher education is often on the chopping block. So that was the low note. Hopefully we are going to be moving into more of the high note. And I probably won't read through all of this, but I am going to touch on several of these because what I want you to see here is a landscape of opportunity. And these are all of the public programs that currently exist that can better support post-secondary education. And so we'll go through a couple of them. SNAP, as I mentioned, which is likely the program that most people in this room are familiar with. It does provide a modest assurance people can meet their basic need for food. However, there are significant restrictions for students. And if you look at those columns on the, I guess it's your right-hand side, you will see some of the challenges that we see. You know, these programs are complex. There are time limits embedded in some of these programs. In some of them, they have academic requirements, and I'll talk about a couple of those. And then some even limit the types of credentials people can pursue. So cash assistance, and obviously there's emergency aid, but I think of that as a more traditional cash assistance or, you know, financial aid program for students. TANF is the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program. It provides income assistance to the lowest families with children in this country. And in fact, the majority of these programs are designed to serve people with children. The SNAP program is an exception there. There are a couple of other exceptions, obviously, but, you know, notions of deservingness and you know, deeply seated deficit-based narratives about working first and the value of low-wage work over education have really created this political climate where people with children are viewed as more deserving. And so in the TANF Cash Assistance Program, there are opportunities to improve access to education. We'll talk about a couple of those. Some of those restrictions include a federal 12-month limit on post-secondary education. There's more nuance to it, but I will just cover that piece off. TANF and the Child Care Assistance, Child Care Development Block Grant Program, which is a federal program that provides child care subsidies for people with very low incomes, have similar restrictions in them, and that there are time limits, there are academic requirements, which mostly align with like satisfactory academic progress. There are limits on credential type. So in one state, for example, you can only receive a child care assistance voucher if you are in a post-secondary program that can be completed in less than 6 months. And then similarly, there are also requirements to pair that post-secondary attendance with work. And then in the Head Start program, Head Start and Early Head Start provide funded early childhood programs that also include health and nutrition education and include parental involvement. So what we think of that as like a 2-gen strategy. And there are not work requirements in the Head Start and Early Head Start program. That is mostly limited by income. Healthcare, Medicaid, which I previously mentioned. And one thing that I want to mention here is there's a lot of confusion around Medicaid and state healthcare exchanges. And I think while states have done a really good job of trying to destigmatize Medicaid and low-income programs, it's actually generated some confusion because people who are actually receiving assistance through the Medicaid program don't know it. In some states, Connecticut, they call it like Husky Health. There's another, Alaska, they call it Denali Care. And so when we think about people's ability to understand where they are benefiting from federal supports, they don't know that they are Medicaid participants. And actually some of this confusion results in less support for the program overall. So Medicaid, as I mentioned, one of the biggest changes is going to be new work requirements. I'm not sure if any of you followed this, but there were huge discussions about, work requirements in Medicaid several years ago that basically got stopped during the Biden administration. And actually, Georgia recently implemented Medicaid work requirements, which overall research shows that work requirements, because of their complexity and how administratively burdensome they themselves are a deterrent from people getting access to the healthcare they need. So not only will people be required to participate in a work or employment and training type program as a condition of receiving healthcare access, the processes of applying for that, recertified, and all of those things are essentially a deterrent. So we call those administrative burdens. Now, in the prior discussions about Medicaid work requirements, states had the option to exempt people participating in post-secondary programs with varying degrees of intensity. So some states decided if you were enrolled part-time and you are working, part-time, then you can qualify for Medicaid. Some states exempted full-time students completely, and we actually don't know how that's going to roll out yet, if states are going to have the ability to modify what counts as an activity to meet that work requirement, which I will say presents an opportunity for states to be at the table talking about the importance of post-secondary education as an included activity. And then when we think about other supportive services, and this is one of the places I think intersects most cleanly and some of the programs you may be familiar with, the SNAP program has the SNAP Employment and Training Program, which is the work support arm of the program, similar to Perkins and WIOA, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act. Every single one of those programs has funds in it to provide resources for supportive services, and that is transportation, books, childcare, emergency aid, uniforms, financial services, licensure fees, welding boots, you name it. And we'll talk a little bit about how some states have leveraged those examples in a couple of slides. So when we think about the new vision to support student access and completion, we have all of our traditional higher education programs that we think about on the left-hand side. And then we think about the availability of non-tuition supports, not only just the scope of what is available, but really the importance of higher education being at the table to be advocates for those resources as an access and completion strategy. We think about this as the new vision for student aid, particularly given that I know many people that I have talked to and work with in our technical assistance efforts at institutions feel frustrated because they feel like now we're expected to be human services experts and now we're expected to be public benefits experts. And that is not what I want you to take away from this conversation. What I want you to take away from this conversation is knowing that these programs exist and that you play an important role in figuring out how to access them as a support strategy for the people that you are working with. So we think about why this work, and this is just to draw the through line. I know many of you in this room already understand this, but we know that systemic racism and intergenerational poverty, combined with the increase of college attendance, has hindered the ability of many families, especially families of color, to access and complete a post-secondary credential. And that is in spite of increased demand for people with post-secondary credentials from employers. So we know students from minoritized and poverty-impacted communities face greater barriers accessing and completing a credential. That hinders their economic mobility and exacerbates the racial wealth gap. And as my colleague mentioned, and as we've seen through Lumina and Gallup have done some really interesting survey research, to keep thinking about this defending the value of higher education question. And what people cite as the greatest barriers are affordability and also having to afford living expenses. So we know that these are the two greatest barriers for people being able to access and complete. And we have a myriad, as I just walked through, of federal and state programs that are available that could better support people's access and completion. So the Government Accountability Office did a report a couple of years ago and found that we have 43 federally funded employment and training programs, which we think of as supportive services for people to improve their education training, administered by 9 federal agencies. And that's outside of anything that we think about in traditional higher education. And not only is that complex, but what I see there is opportunity to access those resources. I have said and will continue to say we don't always need new money to solve these problems. We need to be more strategic and thoughtful about how we are leveraging existing resources. So really aligning federal and state programs that support people's basic needs while they're pursuing a post-secondary credential maximizes federal and state investments in higher education and improves well-being. So let's talk about some of the institutional opportunities. My colleagues touched on a couple of these. Many of you in this room probably already engaged in some of these or are aware of some of them. So really thinking about your role and ability to be at the table and talking about how to align these programs with post-secondary needs. And so I'll give one example. In the SNAP Supplementary Nutrition Assistance Program, everybody has to meet income, citizenship, and household qualifications. And then for people who are subjected to one or both of SNAP's work requirements, there are 2. They have to participate in activities to be as a condition of receiving those benefits. So if you need to meet SNAP's work requirement, you can be working, you can be searching for work, you can even be participating in unpaid volunteering. What you cannot be doing is enrolled in a post-secondary program. There's a little bit of nuance there. But the takeaway there is that is a state choice. And I can tell you exactly where your state policy exists. And if you would like your state to improve upon that, we are happy to talk about that later. But all of the things I'm mentioning here are areas where there is opportunity for your state to do better in aligning these programs with post-secondary attendance. So you can also identify where data sharing can improve outcomes across programs, address discontinuity in programs. So for example, in one of the states that we've been providing technical assistance in, they had WIOA one-stop shop on 90% of their community college campuses. Nobody at the community colleges knew it. These were just completely separate siloed programs. And then in terms of just the low-hanging fruit, we communicate with students in a variety of ways. Just sharing that this information and these programs are available is the lowest hanging fruit. I think, using data to do targeted outreach is important, but also broad outreach strategies have shown to be incredibly effective, not only in engaging people, because for the vast majority of the public benefit programs, which I would consider SNAP, TANF, childcare, Medicaid, housing, your state has an online application where somebody could just go apply. So in terms of not needing to be a human services or a public benefits expert, you could create a social media strategy that is just like, hey, are you having trouble affording groceries this month? Here's the state's website to go apply and see if you may be eligible for benefits. There are more intensive things, centralizing student support services. When I was a student on I went to 2 community colleges like many low-income students do, and then transferred to a 4-year institution. The campus was huge, and I had to probably walk a mile from one side of the campus to other to go from financial aid to career services. So thinking about ways that you're streamlining and centralizing services that are beneficial to all students, not just students facing some sort of economic or temporary hardship. Surveying students about their needs, obviously, and then ensuring programs are flexible and equitable. And one of the things that I think about in terms of that example is for a parenting student to get access to the full tuition assistance that they might be eligible for, they often have to submit an additional request form to have their childcare expenses included in their total cost of attendance. And that's an institutional choice. So where can we reduce some of these burdens and make sure people have access to the full suite of benefits for which they might be eligible? And then there are also community partnerships. So the Delgado Community College, who I used to work with in Louisiana, had this really amazing program where they partnered with a local faith-based organization to provide mental health care services on campus. And all of the licensure and HIPAA and all of the things that were required were handled by that community partner. And then they would have somebody come on campus that would provide both like crisis as needed mental health services or ongoing counseling services as needed. So encouraging partners to promote post-secondary education. There are a host of what I call third-party partners that are engaged in benefits access work in your state. These are your Goodwills, your community action agencies. Partner with them to ensure that they are aware of the programs that you have available and how that they can meet your joint needs with them and your institution are also really smart partnerships. So we're going to dive in here to a couple of very specific examples of where states have leveraged that flexibility that I'm talking about to improve access to public programs. And I will say in each of these instances, these are the options that are available under current federal law that have state flexibility that do not require legislative change at the state level. So in the states that I have worked in before, we work with the Human Services Agency. It's a regulatory change. They change the policy and they update it. So can be low-hanging fruit depending on the state and those partnerships. So in terms of policy choices in Oregon, the state of Oregon allows students who are enrolled. SNAP does not consider somebody a student unless they're enrolled at least half-time. If you are a person who is enrolled less than half-time, you are just subjected to all of SNAP standard work requirements. Enrolled at least half-time, you have to meet a set of additional exemptions to qualify for SNAP. So what Oregon said was, post-secondary programs are employment and training programs. If somebody is enrolled at least half-time by virtue of being enrolled in a post-secondary program and by them self-attesting to how their program will improve their employability, they will qualify for SNAP. And they did all of that through just a state policy choice. Massachusetts has a similar policy where all of their community college students qualify for SNAP. And then there's one four-year institution that's very heavily like CTE focused. And in California has a little bit more of an intensive policy, which there's an argument could be a little bit more, federally defensible if questions get asked. But they have a program called LPIs, which means local programs that improve employability. And so the California Department of Social Services worked with the institutions to say, here's the criteria. If you submit a list of your programs that meet this improves employability metric, we will have access to those programs. And when a student applies for SNAP, if they're enrolled in that program, that will qualify them for SNAP. So there's a host of things that states can do to improve that policy flexibility, to improve access to SNAP. And then in terms of affordability, we use Washington State as a really good example of how they have leveraged their SNAP employment and training program. As I mentioned, SNAP employment and training is the employment assistance arm of the SNAP program. So Washington State has a program called BFET, Basic Food Employment and Training. And what they have done is they are essentially a partner for the state SNAP E&T agency, and they have a SNAP employment and training program at all 35 of their community college campuses. So somebody who is enrolled in one of those programs has access to those additional supportive services, tuition, books, childcare, transportation, uniforms, whatever the case may be. And the benefit there is that SNAP employment and training is a federal state partnership. So for institutions that are spending money on SNAP employment and training dollars, they drop down 50% of the money that they spent from the federal government. And that is a fund actually from the federal government that remains underutilized. So it's estimated that the BFET program is bringing in about $40 million a year in federal dollars to the state of Washington, just in terms of thinking about some of those like win-win scenarios. Oregon has something very similar. It's called Pathways to Opportunity, as well as Pennsylvania Keys. They leverage their SNAP employment and training program to provide additional supportive services, which, because they are eligible for SNAP, they're also receiving that modest benefit amount each month. And then in terms of partnerships, so California, they call their SNAP program CalFresh. There is a federally funded program called SNAP Ed, SNAP Education, and every state has access to this pot of money. So what California did was partner with a nonprofit organization in the state, and they have a very specific CalFresh outreach program on their public college campuses. And they do tons of outreach, and that is a federally funded contract administered through the state to just do benefits outreach on SNAP. They do like eligibility screeners, and they point people to applications. So really interesting ways to leverage those partnerships there. And in Kentucky, there's a program called Connectors. Kentucky is one of the states that we currently work with. I started working with them a couple of years ago on their basic needs implementation work, which included, we did anonymous interviews with state stakeholders to get a lay of the land. Then we pulled together a action network to identify a set of shared objectives across the state. It included state agency people, institutional, community partners. And as part of that action network, what came out of that was the state health agency said, hey, actually, we have benefit navigators that we already pay for with our state health dollars. Why don't we just put one of those on every one of your public college campuses? So just through those conversations and bringing those people to the table, all of the 2-year community colleges in Kentucky and now their 4-year institutions have fully funded benefit navigators that are paid for with state dollars. Okay, so a couple of examples on TANF. TANF is the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, as I mentioned. It provides cash assistance, but one of the other things that TANF can do, and TANF and the Child Care Development Block Grant are block grants, which mean they have significant state flexibility. So in the TANF program, there is a 12-month federal limit on counting post-secondary education as a countable work activity, which just means it does not also have to be paired with work. And that limit is up to 1 year. But for example, Nebraska, and they have done this since welfare reform in 1996, Nebraska said, that doesn't make any sense. Why are we cutting people's access off to education? And so they have just eliminated that 12-month limit. So people who are full-time students in Nebraska have access to TANF supportive services for as long as they are a post-secondary student up to the federal TANF time limit. And the other thing that is important about TANF is it often also affords people access to childcare subsidies. Most people don't know this, but TANF is the second largest federal funding source for childcare subsidies in our country. So Massachusetts, also similarly leveraging their state flexibility, they have a need-based grant program that is funded with TANF dollars. It's called Mass Grant. And the other interesting thing that does is because we have a policy, not to get too wonky here, in the SNAP program called categorical eligibility, which means if you are receiving one benefit program, you are likely eligible for another program. So students in Massachusetts who have access to Mass Grant are also categorically eligible for SNAP. So there's kind of like a twofer there. And similarly, Cal Grant does exactly the same thing. And then we think about partnerships. CalWorks is the state's TANF program. They have liaisons in their county human services offices who there is a name and phone number attached to them where their local institutions can call them and say, I have somebody trying to access CalWorks. Can you assist us with this? So they have that county liaison partnership. And then in Kentucky, they have a program called Ready to Work, which leverages state TANF dollars to provide work study positions on community college campuses for TANF eligible families. And the really cool thing about that is not only does somebody get access to parenting students, in this case, post-secondary education, but they also get access to the work study placement as well as the income from the work study. And the really cool thing Kentucky has done is said, if you are receiving employment dollars through that work study placement, we are going to exempt that from counting against your TANF benefit amount. Because oftentimes we have the cliff effect in public benefit programs, which means somebody who receives a very small raise loses all access to their programs and are often worse off than they were before the raise. So states are trying to think thoughtfully about how to mitigate that and how to smooth that effect so people can grow their income while they're stepping down slowly off of benefits. Maine Hope also has a similar program where they're funding benefits navigators for TANF eligible families. Just doing a quick time check. Okay, and so strengthening access to childcare, there's multiple policy levers here. Georgia DeCal, which is the state's childcare agency, made a policy decision where, currently states have a choice to allow somebody to participate in work or work in education as a condition of receiving a childcare subsidy. And oftentimes what happens in states is because the programs like TANF and childcare are aligned to employment first mentalities, even if somebody could technically get access to a childcare subsidy if they were a post-secondary student, they don't often, because in the determination of who's going to get prioritized, post-secondary students usually get sort of, they get sort of disincentivized from getting those childcare subsidies because of the competition for those resources. So what Georgia Decal did was say, actually, we are going to just designate post-secondary parents as a priority population for our childcare subsidies. And they did that in partnership with their post-secondary institutions, their community college system in their state. Similarly, in Kentucky, their childcare program is called CCAP. And what they have done is say full-time students are completely eligible for childcare subsidies, no need to pair that with additional activities. Part-time students are eligible for childcare subsidies if they pair that with, let's say, 20 hours of work a week. And, we have these conversations about people not having to work as a condition of receiving benefits, which I think is, broadly true. But when we think about the data and we think about the people we are trying to serve, they're most often working because they have to, and getting something like, a modest SNAP benefit or access to a childcare subsidy does not supplant their need to work. So some of these things may be a little bit onerous, but when we look at the reality of what people are facing, most of them are already working. And then we have seen where a couple of institutions are leveraging Perkins dollars and WIOA supportive services to fund childcare services, childcare vouchers, whatever the case may be. And then there's a really cool partnership from the Association of Community College Trustees. I'm not sure if any of you have heard about it here. It's a partnership with the National Head Start Association, where what they are doing is partnering with Head Start providers or people who want to be Head Start providers to establish those Head Start centers on college campuses. And the really beautiful partnership about that is that oftentimes institutions have space, particularly if they've gone to more hybrid teaching models. And what the Head Start center needs more than anything is just the physical space. So it's a really smart partnership in the way that you're trying to address multiple problems. And then again, in Kentucky, Ready to Work, partnering with the State Human Services Agency and the community colleges to close those childcare barriers through that Ready to Work program. Okay, so key takeaways. This is hopefully ending on the high note I mentioned, but we see the challenges that we're facing both in federal policy and how those federal policies are going to be trickling down to the state level. And this is going to require that we are increasingly resourceful about how we accomplish our goals with the same or less resources. And leveraging these public programs really allows us to maximize those investments in higher education. And I want to emphasize in all of the examples that I've given here and across all of the programs that I've mentioned, those things broadly would not have been possible in those states if it were not for the higher education people in those states asking for them to be made a priority. So it is going to be increasingly important that higher education leaders, staff, everybody are at the table with their states talking about how to ensure that post-secondary programs are not excluded from being able to access these benefits in favor of low-wage work. Okay, and as I mentioned, so state technical assistance, figuring out how states have got this done, thinking about what policies exist in your state, we're available for all of these conversations, so feel free to snap my contact information. And Brian, I'm happy to open up for questions.
Any questions? Zach Taylor.
All right. First and foremost, thank you for presenting the 15% reduction of potential SNAP support, because that was like so eye-opening. Holy cow. That was like terrifying actually to see that. Kind of a tough question, but notwithstanding Kentucky and Nebraska and Georgia, I just gather that all of the most humane ideas are coming from blue states. And so how would you support, and I said not withholding Kentucky, in Georgia and Nebraska, but how would you advise institutional practitioners and folks in red states, in institutions, to help? I mean, how do you break through that policy barrier? And talk a little bit about that, because it is really is striking that a lot of the usual suspects, California, Massachusetts, that have these really kind of humanist policies, can be leaders, but is half this country going to listen? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I actually love this question. So I don't think that public benefits access is bipartisan, but I think access to people who are on public benefits to post-secondary education is. And so when we are talking to and working with red states or even policymakers who tend to be more conservative and who tend to be pessimistic about public benefits programs, I start from a place of agreement with them. And I just say, regardless of which side of the political aisle you're on, we can both agree we don't want people having to subsist off of public benefits. And how do we accomplish that? Post-secondary education is reliably one of the best pathways to economic mobility. And in fact, research shows that public benefit participation reliably declines with each level of education achieved. So once we can get to that point and then talk about how do you align it to what the state already cares about? Is it workforce development? Is it, has your state put all of their resources and energy behind high wage, high demand career fields? Have they put it all behind really pushing forward your state's educational attainment effort? So really tying the thing they care about and helping them see where you're in agreement, I think is the best starting off point. It's not always easy. There are barriers there, but
have there, and I'm not sure if I might have just missed this, but have there been any notable changes to the employment and training side of SNAP following the most recent bill passing?
Yeah, so the biggest change there is going to be the new work requirements. And those are going to be more strict, harsh work requirements. And one of the biggest impacts will be currently if a state is or has economically depressed areas or areas of high unemployment, states have the ability to submit a waiver to FNS, Food Nutrition Services, their Department of the Department of Agriculture. They administer the SNAP program to say, we shouldn't be holding it against people that we do not have available jobs in this area. We would like to waive this work requirement temporarily until we can provide better supportive services for people, and that has been severely restricted. So in addition to the work requirements and actually the cuts to benefit amounts, which are going to be coming down, we're going to see losses of pretty significant benefits across the country. Thanks for your question.
In reference to work study requirements, has there been any changes as far as students being in work study and being eligible?
In the most recent federal legislation?
Yes.
Yeah, no, not to my knowledge. But I also haven't been through that section of the bill yet. So somebody could, if anybody disagrees with me there, please feel free to jump in. I will just say one thing about work study. Expanding work study eligibility is an option people can leverage to improve SNAP access in states. But one of the things that I want to highlight about work study is, if you are not aware of this, it's sort of colloquially referred to as the Plymouth Rock model, because institutions' access to work study resources is somewhat based on how long they've been participating in the program, which is somewhat based on how long your institution has been around. So if you're an institution in, New England, you're likely to get more access to resources than you are an institution, say, potentially in the West Coast. But one thing that I do want to highlight is work study is a really great resource, but is incredibly limited, because if you are a student in the highest income quartile at a private four-year institution, you are more likely to get access to federal work study than a two-year student in the lowest income quartile. So we also just think about ways that, I would put federal work study as on the list of things that I would love to fix someday. We'll talk about that later, Brian.
My question is actually more around logistics. Are these slides going to be available post-conference? You had such amazing quality content, and rather than taking a million pictures, would love to be able to share it with colleagues.
Yeah. I'm happy to share those. Just update a couple of sources, probably.
Yeah, they will be. They should be available in Guidebook, but then there's also going to be some internet thing that Phil will be responsible for. So I'll get that info from him, but they will be available somewhere, but Guidebook in the immediate future. All right, I think with that, we are actually going to transition into a 10-minute break, and we'll come back at 11:35 for the next panel, which is talking about Utah. Carrie, as mentioned earlier, will be around all day, and so please feel free to ask any questions that you may have, and thank you so much, Carrie.